Hello again, World Regional Geography. In this second part of Chapter 6, I will go over the economic and social development and the geopolitical topics of sub-Saharan Africa. And the favorite explanations for poverty today look to historical or institutional causes as opposed to environmental reasons. The slave trade historically impacted this region severely, but today the problems are of poor infrastructure. The developmental policies in the 60s and 70s were okay when they first became independent because commodity prices for coffee, minerals like diamonds or gold or lumber were very high. But those commodity prices declined in the 1980s and debt spiraled in the 1990s without sufficient income from exports. Government ministries took over large segments of the economy with disastrous results. They did not follow neoliberal policies of globalization. And with food prices very low, farmers only grew enough for subsistence, and food production didn't meet the needs in the 80s, and that was a huge problem. Farm aid was established, and there were all these huge concerts that went on to try to help people in Ethiopia. Bob Geldof and some of these other rock musicians had these huge concerts that went on worldwide to try to deal with the famine that went on in 22 countries. But today, the population seems to be nourished in many of these formerly famine-stricken areas. It's nowhere near as bad as it was 25, 30 years ago. Corruption is a huge problem in places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Nigeria has been ranked by some business people as the world's most corrupt country. Civil servants like teachers aren't paid a living wage, and they're forced to solicit bribes. The Congo has been described as a kleptocracy, a state where corruption is so institutionalized that politicians and government workers siphon off large amounts of the country's wealth. And President Joseph Mobutu, he skimmed billions from his fellow Congo constituents when he was ruling there. The links to the world economy, historically they were pretty well entwined with the United States and the European Union. That is all changed in the last generation. Trade with China and the rest of Asia, especially India, is growing more and more all the time. Chinese imports account for, that might be a dated statistic now. At one time, 10 years ago, it was a third. It might be higher than that now. They're trying to get more connected to the worldwide net, but the overall lack of infrastructure and finished goods hold the region back. Poor roads are a legacy of the colonial times. Forest products are one major export. And if they are really linked to the world economy, it's more through financial aid than it is through the flow of goods. And those two countries, Burundi and Liberia, have received large national income from aid. The largest recipients of investment are the oil-producing countries of Nigeria, Angola, Sudan, Chad, and Equatorial Guinea. The region isn't viewed as a good risk because of the political instability, but recent trends indicate that they're trying to get into the global system and they are moving towards neoliberalism, privatization. But there's going to be severe income disparities that are created with this entry into the global economy. Many sub-Saharan countries are indebted to the World Bank, not commercial banks as in Latin America and Southeast Asia. The IMF proposes to reduce debt levels if they come up with a strategy for reducing poverty. And many countries have qualified and are redirecting resources into improving services like schools and infrastructure. Again, China is interested in extraction because of the oil that's there. China needs oil and they need the mining products. And that's one of the big exports of sub-Saharan Africa. They offer money for infrastructure in exchange for those commodities. And they don't really get involved in the domestic affairs. So leaders view them as a new kind of trade partner. one uninterested in ideology or political agendas like the United States or the former Soviet Union. And Angola is the largest supplier of oil to China today, beating out Saudi Arabia. China did support the socialist governments in the 70s, but today investment is strictly a commercial relationship. Western countries have become jealous because many of the Chinese still trade with human rights abusers like Sudan and Zimbabwe. And some African countries have been hurt. Garment workers have lost jobs to Chinese competition. But overall, China believes they are developing an area that has long been neglected by globalization. Economic differentiation. Mauritius and Seychelles are islands that have little in common with the mainland because they are based on tourism, these regions. Whereas on the continent itself, 1/2 of all Africans living south of the Sahara live on $1 to $2 a day. I'm sure that's a dated statistic now at the end of the 2010s. It's gone up from that, but not a lot. There are still millions of Africans that live in extreme poverty. If they are involved in oil and mineral production, they have a higher standard of living. And with the redistribution of wealth, the lives of the average citizens overall could improve. It's possible. South Africa is the region's unchallenged economic powerhouse. That region is as prosperous as any part of the world because of what they produce. It's diverse, and they have the extraction economy minerals that the rest of the world wants. Diamonds, especially. The geopolitical considerations. European colonization had a huge impact on Africa. The scramble of Africa was a competition between the European nations themselves. They did this because they were competing with other Europeans and who was going to be the strongest. This was a social Darwinist time, the late 19th century. And imperialism was justified by Europeans as an arena to prove who was the fittest. And the machine gun greatly aided colonization. Rivalry between France, who largely was involved in West Africa, Equatorial Africa, and Madagascar, and Britain, who largely controlled Egypt, began the game of empire building. Soon Belgium controlled the Congo, Germany controlled Togo, Namibia, Tanganyika, and Cameroon. Italy got into Ethiopia in the 1930s and the 20s. And Portugal controlled Angola and Mozambique. All of these European imperial powers eyed territory on the continent. Liberia and Sierra Leone were set up as states for former slaves, and Sierra Leone remained a protectorate of Great Britain into the 1960s. Liberia was populated by ex-American slaves who attempted to rule over the indigenous groups. It remained independent with serious trouble. In the late 19th century, Otto von Bismarck called a Berlin Conference where all the European imperial powers met, and they established rules for their control, and basically sub-Saharan Africa was carved up between the Europeans at that time. And that's when those borders were established between the nation states that did not have any consultation with African leaders, and they took no consideration of historic ethnic groupings or tribal groupings. And that struggle continues today with those artificial boundaries that were imposed. And that's why a lot of the ethnic conflicts have gone on. Ethiopia defeated Italy at the turn of the 20th century, but then the fascists that took over under Mussolini, they will reverse that in the 1930s. After World War I, the German colonies were stripped, and Great Britain and France took those regions over. Belgium continued to control the Congo. Portugal still had the same two areas. And there's a good map in the textbook if you want to see this. Rhodesia was named for Cecil Rhodes, and the Rhodes Scholarship comes from this gentleman who made a bundle in the mineral extraction economy, and that prevented the Portuguese control of the entire region above South Africa. The original Dutch colonists slowly moved north from Cape Town, and the Afrikaners, or the Boers, were pastoralists who believed in their racial superiority. And the Boer War took place between the Boers, the Afrikaners, and Britain. They eventually settled into new lands, which became the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, which was for whites only. The Boers and the Zulu tribesmen then battled it out in these regions, and this went on for a lot of the 19th century. Shaka Zulu was a famous warrior of the Zulu tribes, and he introduced new military techniques, and they were not defeated until the machine gun came in 1878. And without that technology, they never would have gotten these native tribes subdued. The tribes could not fight against the machine gun. They got slaughtered. And the Afrikaners still resisted British control, and the Boer War finally solved this, and they were defeated. But this was the first country in Africa to become independent. Eventually the Brits recognized South African independence in 1910, and eventually the Afrikaner National Party got control, and they introduced apartheid, which is segregation. And all of these features were similar to Jim Crow in the United States. Homelands were similar to Indian reservations in the United States. And apartheid will exist into the late 80s and finally ends in the 1990s with the election of Nelson Mandela. There has been many ethnic conflicts. We've talked about that already in the previous video. And Darfur was the most recent one that ended at the beginning of this decade. And these were some of the things that went on in Darfur. 4 million people died in West Africa during these different conflicts during this decade. And they've been accused of genocide. And that's why South Sudan was set up. And there was 250,000 refugees living in Chad at one time. They've attempted to aid some of these refugees. This fighting in the Congo is still going on now. It's over 5 million have died. That is a dated statistic. It's now over 5 million in the conflicts that have continued to this day. Mr. Kabila attempted to end some of these conflicts. There's periodic secession movements. Zaire from the Congo in 1975, the Igbo from Nigeria, and both of these rebellions have been crushed. Somalia disintegrated. The Tom Hanks movie and the piracy that went on in that part of the world. It's an excellent Hollywood movie. The Somalis are largely controlled by Islamist groups. Eritrea gained independence from Ethiopia after 20 years of conflict. And it's been peaceful in recent years. And those are some of the geopolitical considerations of sub-Saharan Africa. So ends this particular chapter.